Hello, everyone. Welcome to
Hi.
the Politics of Tyranny. We're going to take a short little, what is it, the 7th inning stretch? Is it?
Yeah, I believe so. In
Okay,
baseball,
thanks,
you,
man.
yeah,
I've been reading books to my child about baseball. We don't actually
never
watch
actually
baseball.
seen a baseball game. I hear it's quite exciting.
It's funny because all the major like story narratives that we have, Star Wars, Superman, he's getting the like coloring book as the first instance
Oh
of
yeah,
it.
yeah, right.
And what's amazing
That's
is
awesome.
he loves it with more passion, I think, than I could possibly have ever imagined. Even though he can't connect everything. He just understands that this is a unique world that he has a little portal into, and he's living it.
Cool.
It's irrelevant to what we're talking about today. We thought what we would do is look at some questions because people are listening to this.
Amazingly.
Yeah, I think at some point, one would hope we'll get shut off of YouTube or.
We got to figure out what to say that'll make that happen.
It's it's algorithmic.
Okay.
You could start singing like copyrighted songs.
Okay.
That would do it. So we'll think about. The point is that people are in fact asking us some questions, and normally my impulse when people ask me questions about anything I've done, especially with writing, is to be like, "Oh, are we still thinking about this?"
Yeah.
I mean, which is terrible. But for writing for me, it's like it's a birth process, right? Like it's a gestation, a labor, some suffering, and then it's there.
Right.
So when people like are then
and you have to revisit it.
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't want to. It's like
I know, but you have to.
Exactly, because you owe it to people.
Yeah.
Especially the child that was born. So people are asking some questions, and there's some good questions. And so I typed up. All right, I copied and pasted 5 of them.
Okay.
One of them has a lot in there, so we'll go through it. That I thought deserved a good response because, we're talking about tyranny. We're saying that it is rule for private gain, and that it hides itself as such by deploying various mechanisms by which it appears in some ways as rule for the common good, and by which it enables people to participate in the constructing of a tyrannical social order.
Right.
Because again, we keep saying this, but if tyranny was ever revealed as it was, it'd be very much like the devil revealing himself as he is, repulsive.
Right.
So he has to disguise himself as an angel of light. Likewise, the
tyranny. Yeah, that's right. It's dishonest. It must be. Tyrants are liars.
Big fakers.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe why we most want to behead them.
Yeah.
Just to stop the lying. I think.
Frustrating.
So, anyways, I think. Never mind. I was going to say something about Biden. I think he's a liar.
Really?
Well, there was that whole thing where he was like, the Pope told me to keep receiving communion.
Oh yeah.
When
I said really, I meant it like in a sort of like personal culpability sense, not like a formal sense. Of course he's a liar.
Yeah,
but like in like or a material sense. I mean, of course he is.
Right.
But I have a sort of pity because I'm like, oh, he might not know.
He might be like just like a pathological liar. I mean, this is
or that it's just become that he's been so sort of degraded into just being a sort of conduit for whatever.
Well, politics will do this to you in some ways. Like I was running for city council here, and I was like knocking on doors and telling people to vote for me.
Yeah,
and it's amazing how quickly you're willing to lie. Like people would ask me what I'm for, and your initial like animal reaction is like, well, what do you want me to be for? Isn't that terrible?
Yeah,
but it's how the
it's really bad, and I mean,
democracy is built up. I mean, has this idea that we're going to be honest, and that's why we're going to find people that can represent our interests because they're there. But then when you actually hit the ground, it's like, yeah, but everyone's just going to lie about what they represent in order to get your vote.
Well, yeah, and one of the reasons why I hesitate with the whole Joe Biden liar thing is because it feels like normally that's the case. Mm-hmm. Like normally the politician is just a liar,
right?
But the politician is in fact the one who's like lying and manipulating. But in this situation, I feel like it's gone one step deeper, right? Where like the biggest lie is that we don't really know who's lying to us.
Mm.
Because I don't think he's in charge of the lies he says, is what I'm saying. Like Barack Obama or whoever, I think he was lying to us.
Yeah.
Here, I'm not really sure who is. and that I find that to be more disturbing.
Well, this might help us with our first question
Okay.
because I think it's extremely relevant to Joe.
Poor Joe.
Are the tyrants conscious they are tyrants?
Wow.
And I think this is actually a really good question.
That's a great question.
Because if you kind of read it on the face of it, we're very much talking about, well, the tyrant does this in order to get that. Tyrant institutes propaganda. The tyrant, needs a bureaucracy.
Right.
So but we're also at the same time saying, but the only way you even have tyranny is if everyone is involved in some way through the deployment of fear throughout a society, which kind of begins to ask the question, well,
does a tyrant know he's a tyrant?
On purpose? Like if you're just born in a tyrannical society, you think about, you might, I feel like they certainly would never say they were a tyrant, right?
Well, of course, that's part of being a tyrant.
Right.
but it's a similar question, isn't it, to asking, does the sinner know he's sinning? I think. Isn't that a similar question?
Well, maybe. Because
the answer is always yes and no, right? Like if the sinner doesn't rationalize the sin somehow because he's a human being, so he's always desiring the good in some sense.
Right.
He's always rational. He's an intellectual being, so he's producing rationalizations for his actions in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that a human being is capable of a pure sin, like when we say sin, we must be including the falsification of the intellect, the falsification of the will.
Right.
So we're including the rationalizations, the self-delusions, the trickery that we're subjecting ourselves to. That's intrinsic to the idea of sin, right? So it seems like the tyrant. I mean, but you can descend into viciousness to the point where, I mean, it can go all the way to the point of like explicit devil worship, right? Where you're getting pretty close to evil for evil's sake, but you haven't quite gotten there.
Right.
So tyranny seems to be similar.
Yeah.
Right. That there are people who want to amass power and wealth. They know they're trying to amass power and wealth. That's what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
If you think about the definition, rule for private gain, then in some ways, I think, most tyrants are conscious they're tyrants because they're conscious that they're ruling for private gain. Now, what they do with that consciousness is the next question. So if you look at our corporate sort of business world rulers, increasingly just our rulers, they will say that they're ruling for private gain.
That's right.
Absolutely. They'll just say that my rule for private gain is what's best for everyone. If I,
that's right. Yeah.
Produce all of these cool devices and technologies, and I will allow,
well, there's
vast
also,
majority
I mean,
of humanity
the whole
to reach
system
goods.
works that way, right? Where like the whole sort of Adam Smith system.
Yeah.
Like everybody working for private gain is what's best for all of us.
Right.
Right. Like they make that justification. Yeah. So I
mean,
guess
a pure tyrant, like if you could imagine it, would say, I'm ruling for private gain, and I don't
care.
Give a damn if it's for the public good.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Somehow.
But I think it becomes darker, because I think the tyrant themselves, because it's disordered, becomes a slave to the systems that they've created, right? So tyranny fails. So I guess what I'm saying, it's not like you succeed in being a tyrant. Like, you ultimately build, even if you're a very successful one, you ultimately build the mechanisms that crush you too,
100%.
right? Like, and so in the Bible, we get the examples of like the tyrannical kings that sacrifice their own sons to the gods.
Or it's a really
the gods are nothing other than a mechanism of their power, but they
have to
do it,
right? Because
in order to maintain the mechanism of their power, they have to kill their own son.
Maybe one easier way into that is the use of eunuchs. So throughout, I'm thinking of like ancient tyrants, so we can recognize a clear type. Well, one of the ways of successfully creating a more pure bureaucracy was to use castrated males. Because if you can castrate people as slaves, then they can't produce a family.
Right.
And they don't have loyalties to, because they're slaves, they don't have loyalties to whatever family they've been ripped apart from. So you have a sort of actually atomized, isolated individual. To some extent.
Right. I see what you're saying. So they become devoted to the system.
Devoted to the
because
system.
that's where they
devoted
fit.
to the tyrant.
That's where their safety. That's where they prosper. That's where they.
But historically, eunuchs then. So this is what you do. You're buying and selling eunuchs, and they usually tend to form the power structure around the imperial court.
Mm-hmm.
So whether we're looking at Syria or China or Persia, obviously, this is the
even the Byzantine Empire.
Byzantine, yeah, it gets a little weird
there because they're Christians. But anyway, go ahead.
So, okay, but then you have that, but then you also have, you think about the story of Jezebel in the Bible. When Jezebel dies, it's because her eunuchs throw her off of the parapet. She dies.
Yeah.
And this is also as common a story as the amassing of eunuchs, is that eventually the eunuchs start to run the show and often are essentially choosing the emperor or, the ruling power.
They're the deep state.
Yeah, essentially, right? It's because if you say, okay, I want to rule and I'm going to rule by, denigrating the human person into a mere extension of my will. Okay, you can kind of do that to some extent. But then that is where the power is now.
Mm-hmm.
And to some extent it's diffused throughout those couriers, messengers, this whole. Because the thing is, people never actually become pure representations of your will.
Right.
They always have their own. So then they always, at some point, become the system that, as an emperor, well, now you have to work through the system that you've made. You have to consult the eunuchs. They have to be on your side.
The line between dominating and manipulating the mob and having to worship the mob is very thin.
100%.
Like you cross over. Right, between those things. The mob, yes, you can manipulate it, but you also have to placate it. You also have to be afraid of it. You've created this mob. The mob is the source of your power, but the mob is fickle.
Well, and this goes back to our episode on fanaticism, right? So once you create a people that are fanatics and will live and die for almost anything because they're so atomized and isolated from regular sources of community and authority, that's great. So long as you don't become their enemy.
Right. No, and the thing about tyranny, of course, is that one tyrant is never alone. There are rivals.
Right.
So the mechanisms that a tyrant is producing are transferable to his rival. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, you end up on the receiving end. Almost every tyrant does. How many tyrants die of old age?
Yeah, right. Look at the decline of the Roman Empire.
But all of this, to get back to the original question, do the tyrants know what they're doing? Yes, sort of. Then they become victims of their own tyranny, I think. I also think another thing that maybe would be worth considering is one of the things that the tyrant does. Okay, so we talk about non-tyrannical power, non-tyrannical regimes as truth-based. Mm-hmm. So we're pursuing the truth. We're trying to perceive what it is as an intellectual component to it. And then building social structures that sort of instantiate that truth in a way that works. Okay, that's the sort of just way of conceiving of it. But tyrants are indifferent to the truth, right? And tyranny is, but that doesn't mean that they're not intellectual beings. And so I think part of what happens is that it becomes reversed, so that it's not the question of are they doing something because they believe it becomes the wrong question. The question is they're doing something tyrannical and they're willing to believe whatever helps them do that. Mm-hmm. Right? So do they really believe what they're saying? Sure.
Yeah.
But the reason why they believe it is because it's useful.
Right.
But not because it's true.
Oh, yeah.
But they really have deluded themselves into believing it because they'll just shift from one thing to the next to believe whatever works.
And that's a really good point, because the sign of a person really believing is precisely what allows you to develop a fanatical devotion. Mm-hmm. Like, you can't do it if you think they don't believe in it, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right. So I think the tyrant himself becomes fanatical is the point.
Yeah. That's true.
Because he'll believe whatever works as well.
You know where you sometimes see this is in a small scale is like, I think people can experience this on social media sometimes, because you might have like truth concerns and be talking about them. Mm-hmm. But then you just say something that you're like, you might be convicted, but you're just kind of like mad, and you put it out there, and then suddenly, okay, that's the thing that everyone, okay, now they're sharing you and they're commenting, and then you realize that that's efficacious now. right? So then you start to do, I mean, you see this in the decline of any like
So now
intellectual
you
project.
backfill all the rationality you need, and you make the arguments that make it work. And,
And then
you come to believe it.
Now the motivation is what works to get the support. But then the truth is no longer the concern. It's just the thing that you need to have, and you need other people to believe that you have in order for to amass that kind of weird social power.
Right.
I mean, it's sad because you see people go through it, right? It's like the concern begins with truth, and then it ends with just.
But I think because we're human beings, deep down inside, there's a nagging conscience.
One would hope.
Yeah, I think that's there.
That's good.
Even if it's buried, really.
Yeah. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful with are the tyrants conscious? They are tyrants. Sometimes.
Well, I mean, I don't mean to just go back to that question, but you think about like what are the ways that tyranny? I know we're wasting too much time. One of the ways that tyranny manifests itself in the sort of everyday world would be in something like consumerism, which is maybe a topic for another podcast, but that's using your purchasing power for self-interest, right? So all I care about with the power I have in my money is my own consumption. So I'm a consumer. That's what I am. But do people feel guilty about that? Well, they do. But I don't know if they feel guilty about it because they think they're tyrants. They might not realize that they're misusing their power. Sure. It might be other reasons why they're guilty about it.
And it would be that kind of guilt that coexists with still doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so that's just, we can move on now. Sorry.
It's like people that are guilty about having a smartphone.
Yeah.
Doesn't change having a smartphone. It's just there.
You just know it's bad.
All right. Anyways, this relates. Now this is specifically in reference to our discussion on propaganda. So what we said is that the tyrant needs to have propaganda because you needs to be able to deliver a false world, which isn't coherent. It's not the real. It comes from the tyrant. It makes him the kind of source of the social order. And what this gentleman asked was, under this definition, would you say that all entertainment is propaganda, or at least has propagandist traits? Because entertainment, including even books and theater, usually provides no opportunity for dialogue. It is simply received from above, as you described. A couple like corollary questions, but is the difference then in the content of the message being communicated and whether it correlates to the real world versus an invented one? Interesting question. So I'll take a brief step at this. So I think, I do think that I would say most entertainment is propaganda. Let's start with that. Me too. Because most entertainment is currently predicated on the destruction of communal forms of entertainment. So what I mean by that is, and he talks about books and theater and stuff, and I want to push back a little bit on that, because when you have, say, dancing or theater or singing, concerts, things that are things we do together, it is true that you establish a certain relationship of power. I mean, you're in an aesthetic mode, but it's still that there's one person giving and you're receiving, or a whole group of people giving and you're receiving. But it's a real relationship of audience to performer, right? Or in something like a dance, that even kind of goes away. It's like but in entertaining ourselves in that way, I would still say that the form is dialogue, right? Because there is an actual ability to assess the gift as it is given, right?
Sure. I mean, dialogue, when you and I are having a dialogue, I talk and then you talk. We don't talk at the same time. Right.
Sometimes we do.
Yeah, but that's always a mistake.
Yes.
Or sometimes it can have sort of like an effect. That's nice, but you're not supposed to do it. So the fact that people are taking turns talking is not itself a problem. So I think we can conceive of things even like books as being people taking turns talking, right? So I read their book, I write something about their book, they read my book. I mean, a healthy academic climate would operate this way, right? Even novels, literature, that kind of discourse can be occurring on a different scale than a one-on-one
Oh,
conversation.
absolutely. And if you think about the history of novels, I mean, the good ones are usually responses to each other. I mean,
Yeah, so
Dostoevsky
they're responding, but I think so. I think we have to be careful about sort of over making that form overly rigid and not seeing that we're talking about something that can have a bigger social dynamic going on. You know, the conversation happens over the course of generations. It happens, right? I mean, it's a big conversation, but I think a key idea would be that the conversation is oriented towards truth.
Mhm.
So and towards the good of the one you're conversing with.
Mhm.
So one key aspect of propaganda is that it has an ulterior motive.
Mhm.
I think that's so when you talk about like our current entertainment, you watch a TV show now. If you're watching a TV show, its objective is to get you to watch the next one, right? Like that's what it doesn't. It's not. Its objective is to get you to consume more so that they can sell you more advertising, right? Or show you more advertising. I mean, that's what they're trying to do. And so what that means is that the show itself is just more advertising. It's advertising for itself. It's advertising for, so it has an ulterior motive in it.
This is why I had to just stop watching shows, because it would always be so disappointing.
Because you're so manipulated that you get frustrated. Yeah.
Well, I get frustrated because they use the goods of story,
Mhm.
like end of dialogue, to actually begin, because you have to, because you want good things.
Right.
But then around like season 2 or whatever,
Right.
it becomes self-evident that there's no plan to the show. They begin to respond in real time to the reactions of you know what I mean?
I know exactly
to
what you're
to the
talking
sales,
about.
to the numbers.
Absolutely. I mean, this is my wife and I have talked about this all the time. It's like season 2 on any show is when you turn it off.
Well, because season 2, they just end up talking about which people within the show that you've established are now having like soap opera type relationships.
Exactly,
It's like, okay, we've established this really interesting world, and now we're watching a soap opera.
But the idea though, I think, is that the idea we're getting at here is that this is a form of sophistry in the classical sense of manipulating language and rhetoric and manipulating your audience for an ulterior motive, right? It's like communication for hire. It's mercenary. And that I think is necessarily a propaganda situation.
And I would say this, like there's no like pure form that can't become propaganda, right? Like you might wax poetic about like theater or books, but obviously you could
absolutely use it for propaganda purposes.
Yeah.
And part of that would be that it's not engaging in the dialogue. Okay, so it is attempting to dominate the conversation rather than to engage in it, whatever the cultural conversation is, and that it has an ulterior motive, right? Like these things, and part of what that means is that another way of saying that is that instead of engaging in the world building process that is the truth seeking dialogue, they're attempting to impose a world. So they're seeking to dominate that dialogue, and they have an ulterior motive. So it's not the truth, it's something else, which means the world they present to us is a lie. Right. Or incidentally true. It could be, I suppose.
Right.
But I mean, here or there. So
no, that's a good distinction.
I think that's important.
It's a good distinction, and it means that not all entertainment is propaganda, or it doesn't have to be. The act of being entertained by someone is a step in a dance, a part of a dialogue. You know.
Yeah, that's right.
The question is rather, is that in fact what the particular piece of entertainment is for, and if it's actually
and even the presenting of fictitious worlds, it's important that we understand that we have a sophisticated understanding of what we mean by that, right? I mean, the telling of stories, of myths, of plot lines that are established, fairy tales. These are all fictitious, right? But that's because one of the modes of communicating truth is storytelling. That doesn't mean they're a lie, right? They're just fiction. But when we say a fictitious world, we mean a dishonest one, right? Like a lie.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's important.
I think that answers that. Totally.
Okay.
I know you guys have said that we have been living under a tyranny for some time. Is there a time you can point to and say, that's when tyranny began to rear its ugly head?
Yeah. When the serpent tempted Adam and Eve.
Right, yeah.
They did it.
Maybe in America. I don't know. I mean, I think at this point, if we understand rule for private gain, we have to say, look, there's no because that's ultimately an interior act, because what all structures of sin rest on are personal sin. I mean, this is really important, that it's not like, it's like a fractal pattern. Like what social tyranny is what the individual act of being a tyrant is. It's like those have this mere relation. And obviously you can't know exactly when someone decides to rule for private gain. I mean, maybe it's the moment that
maybe it's true one day and not true the next day.
Exactly. Yeah.
but I think the point here, the real gist of this question is like a historical sociological question. When did our society? The problem answering it is that when we say we live in under a tyranny now, we have to understand that what we're saying is that the tyrannical form has gained ascendancy over the non-tyrannical form. Not that they're not still engaged in a struggle.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So I think this can get us to the idea of the city of God and the city of man, the sign of a sort of Augustinian understanding of history. There's always the city of God and the city of man, and they're always engaged in a struggle. And the city of man, though, can gain the ascendancy. And the city of God is sort of operating in a rearguard way, or in a missionary way, maybe would be a better way of putting it. But it's always still there, because human beings are ultimate. And it's actually not only always still there, it's always ultimately the true reality, because human beings, even in a tyrannical society, are pursuing the good, right? Even if they have that perverted. So the city of God is always the ultimate reality. So there's always the non-tyrannical order somewhere deep down, if you dig deep enough. Now, I think if we're just talking about the United States, then I think what we're talking about is a historical process whereby the social networks of solidarity, so the social networks, the social forms that provided meaning in life, government in life, prosperity in life, and in the end, I mean, I guess we're just talking about human flourishing, that provided the possibility for happiness, social happiness, that those forms have been steadily pushed out and replaced by tyrannical forms, right? Who seek to fill the voids that as those forms are pushed out.
Yeah.
Now, I think this began from the very beginning. This has been going on. It's been going on since the Reformation. It's been going on,
Right. But in some ways, I know that sort of Schindler, Hanby would argue that it was present in our Constitution in the specific.
Yeah, the problem with that,
liberal project,
I mean, that's correct. They're right, obviously, I think. But maybe, so it's not the problem with that. Maybe an added component would be that the United, like part of it's a mistake to, it's actually maybe the mistake of falling prey to the tyrannical concept to look only at what the elites are doing and think that's it.
Yeah, right.
Right. Oh, here's the formal documents. Here's the Constitution.
Yeah, the Constitution made the tyranny happen.
And not to realize, no, that those things may all be tyrannical in form, but it takes a very, very long time for that to actually propagate itself into in sort of an imperialistic way, replace what's actually on the ground.
Yeah.
And what's actually on the ground in most places are communities of solidarity.
Yeah, right.
Villages, churches, farming communities.
Right.
Like
these might have wrong ideas, but those wrong ideas haven't yet.
And they're tyrannical in some ways, but in a much less degree.
Maybe one way to put it is this. Look, at the moment at which it became a believable thought, whenever this was, that the important thing in a human life was to leave your family and get a job somewhere else. That is, at the very least, you could say that's where the tyranny it became more recognizable as the real social order than what preceded it.
Yes, I think you can see lots of things. I mean, maybe it's easy. The economic side might be the easiest for us to see because it's just like in our face, right? So, but I think maybe another way would be the sort of forms of social life. What I mean is, as we get to the point where there's a sort of typical middle class way of being, and that way is the same. It doesn't matter if you're in Phoenix or in Philadelphia or something. When you start seeing things like that, you must be seeing a shift to the tyrannical.
Mm-hmm.
You know what? Because the homogenization, the tyrannical form is dominating,
Mm-hmm.
and so you're losing regional differences. I mean, if you want to look at it from like an anthropological point of view, losing accents, losing customs,
Mm-hmm.
losing those are all evidence that those solidarity-based forms of government are being replaced
Mm-hmm.
by centralized amassing systems, I think.
That's fair to
So
say.
when does all that begin? I mean, you get massive accelerations in the 1930s, massive accelerations during World War II, right? Massive accelerations and then into the 50s. And these things aren't incidental. I mean, if you look at propaganda, we were just talking about propaganda. I mean, the history of propaganda, and this isn't like some sort of like radical critique. It's like just factual that the men who invented modern propaganda for World War I, when the war ended, went directly into marketing. Like they started the first marketing outfits and the first PR outfits, who then completely switched gears for the Second World War and became propagandists for the war, perfected the art, and then went to New York City and started the big advertising firms. I mean, it's actually like the same guys, and they didn't even distinguish between the word. I mean, marketing was a word that started to be used only in the middle of the century because they used propaganda for marketing until it became too associated with like the Nazis and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then you stop using the word propaganda, but we weren't even distinguishing in the language until then. Right. So like those are acceleration points where these forms become dominant.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Something like that. That's
a good answer. All right. 2 more here. Well, I'm going to switch the order here. Okay. So this is the one where we might need to be careful on. It says this begs one major. Actually, he said this is amazing, but it all begs one major question. So that's really nice.
That's nice.
How is the church not itself a tyranny? We talk about propaganda, but is dogma negotiable? We talk about scale. It's not the hierarchy, the clerical hierarchy, scaled authority. We talk about tyranny being the will of one exercised over many. Isn't God a tyrant, and thus also anyone acting in the name of God? I know how you identify the Bible as being the anti-tyrannical guidebook, but how does the church maintain itself in a dogmatic and organized sense without becoming tyrannical at every level, from Pope to catechism class? And then he said some other nice stuff about us. But what are we doing here? Just saying nice things about us? No. We're on the firing line. What is that called? Wasn't it like a TV show? Get hard questions, the hot seat, something like that.
Yeah.
I think this is a huge question.
Yeah.
But it's not easy to answer. So one of the things is that we got to go back to the Old Testament, I think, because the church is the fulfillment of the old. You can't understand the new law, the new society, without looking at the course of history, like where it came from. And what you see in the Old Testament is a certain method from God, in that he, from the beginning, is graciously responding to what we make of the world. Okay, so when he creates Adam, he gives him the command to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. But it's already clear that God is not controlling Adam in how he will build the world. I mean, he gives the animals for him to name, and he's really, says God waited to see what he would name the animals.
St. Thomas goes so far as to say that man participates in God's providence.
Yeah, it's wild.
So he's free. Mm-hmm. Providence.
Yeah, I mean,
that's a strong word.
You wouldn't want to go so far as to say that we could surprise God with what we do, but pretty close to that.
Yeah. I think that's the best we could do to imagine it. What it would.
Yeah,
be.
Exactly.
I mean, I don't think that's a mistake for us to imagine it that way.
Right. The best analogy is a father surprised at what his child has made.
Yeah.
And then we have to say, okay, but that's infinitely not like what it is.
Yeah. Okay.
But having said that, okay, so that's the world. Now, then we sin and we start to build a bad world. We start to go down instead of up, towards the devil instead of God, towards sin instead of virtue, etc., etc. The whole tired, sad story. But we don't destroy who we are. We are still world builders, right? And God doesn't destroy who he is. He is still the Father who has ordained that he will be in this position of receiving the world from us as we try to make it into something good. I mean, we're not, but that's the structure.
Right.
That's what a human being is.
That's right.
That's Dasein.
Awesome.
Forget Heidegger. Let's move on. So there we are. And we start to build things that are really bad for the sake of trying to be like God. We envy divinity. We reject our human condition, and so we start to do things that God had no. When we say God had no plan for, because I say that because that's biblical language. God looks at something, for instance, like animal sacrifice, right? So we start to do things like sacrificing people, and then sacrificing animals, and at some point in the prophets, God says, why are you trying to feed me the flesh of bulls? If I was hungry, I would tell you. And he says things like, speaking of human sacrifice, like, I never thought of it. I never had any plan for this, which is, so what the language is showing is that we can create forms that are not good. But then what doesn't happen is God doesn't come and just obliterate these forms. So we create things like altars to offer sacrifice and priests to do it. Not because we're looking at some heavenly archetype and making an altar. That was the plan, and the priest, that was the plan. But because we're doing things like sacrificing humans.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. And then sacrificing animals.
But because we're not totally depraved, those actions always have within them a kernel of our nature. Right. So,
which is why we can look back at them and say, well, there's something here that points to like the total sacrifice of the self that was desired. But the reason this gets confusing is sometimes then what people think is they think in an evolutionary term.
Right.
Like we have this kind of like rote Darwinism. So we look back at it and we say, oh, so what was happening was there was this like rough kind of sense that we're supposed to give ourselves to God that got through history progressively.
Yeah, right. So I mean, a great example of this would be
purified.
The temple.
Yeah.
Right. So it's very common in Catholic circles to talk about Eden as a temple, and as Adam as a priest, and as the project is to build the temple for God, to build the world as a temple. These sorts of things, and then we think, oh, then later there are temples, and we sometimes later in history, and we sometimes therefore say, like, have the analogy going that way, like we think, oh, this sort of primordial temple was then instantiated as these real, but it's actually the opposite, right? That where temples as temples, like the literal temple, appears is in paganism, right? And then God says, yeah, I see what you're doing there, right? Like that's really wrong, but it's not completely wrong, right? Like what you're doing is building a world oriented towards worship, building it. And that can be appropriated from within your construction and redirected towards me. So I will be your God. So now we'll build a temple, but there's no idol in it. Right. So is it really a temple like the pagans had? Well, no, it's sort of, but it's been sort of taken up and changed. Now we have this temple form. Now we can go back to Genesis and go, look, what this primordial form is like the temple. Right. But the analogy is going the other direction historically, right? The temple is the prime analogous. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right. Like Adam, and similarly with the priest.
With the priest the same way, kingship the same way.
Right. So okay, so this being the case, what we can see in the Old Testament is God looking at our broken forms and saying, I will humble myself to take up this world that you're building despite its brokenness and enter into it so that you can have communion with me. Okay.
So that I can touch you.
You've invented gods. Okay. I will be a god.
I will be your God.
And he says a god. I mean, he makes it.
I know.
He literally
profoundly
says,
humbling.
I will become a god like unto the other gods. And that's precisely what you see in the early days of Israel, is them acting like they've got Yahweh and other people have other gods and they're going to go fight.
Right. So you're really into sacrifice. I will command you to sacrifice to me.
Right. Right.
so that you don't sacrifice to something else.
Exactly. You're really into temples. You're really
it
into
really seems important.
militaries.
Yeah.
Like, I will become commander of your armies. I will
All of
enter
which
into these
are
forms.
acts of condescending that takes some of the corrupt forms and redeems them to a certain degree.
Yeah, and that redemption is really important for this question here, because what redemption kind of is a twofold movement. Like on the one hand, you can look at it and say, okay, redemption is taking something that's bad and then making it good.
Mhm.
Okay. But there's another thing happening, that when you take up a bad form and then make it for God, as it were, it also prevents us from having that form in its bad mode.
Oh, and
anymore.
it actually is a different thing.
Yeah.
It just looks like it.
Right. But what I
So it tricks us.
right. But what I'm trying to get at, if you look at the Old Testament, right, like how can you have the abhorrence of human sacrifice, of idolatrous temples that you see characterizing it, except for that God has given one true temple.
That's right.
Right. And one sacrificial regime in which human sacrifice is rejected. So what I mean is, you could as much say it is a method of making the tyrannical part of the forms that we create impossible for people. I mean, that's what the Old Testament is. It's like,
So look at the law.
Yeah,
right.
We should
so
narrow in on something here.
The law is given to the people of God by God as if He is their king.
Yeah.
So the law is given in the same sort of way that human laws, corrupt laws, are given by God kings, by pagan God kings, the same sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
But the God king happens to actually be God.
Right.
Right. Okay. So the law then has the form, in some ways, of the pagan sort of God king regimes, but because it's true rather than corrupt, it's not ordered towards the private gain. It's not ordered towards the tyranny. It's not ordered. It's telling the truth. It's not lying. So it's not propaganda.
Right,
so and the king who they receive, Israel is given, is not really a king. Or another way to put it, maybe, or not really a pagan king, but maybe the way to put it would be that he's more perfectly a king, because he lacks the corruption that's in the pagan kings. So he doesn't issue laws; he meditates upon the law.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He judges the law and mediates it, but isn't the source of it.
Right.
Right. So this is not, we call him David king, but is he a king?
Right.
He's not a king the way Pharaoh's a king.
Right. He can't just say, this is my will, let it be done.
But then we say, well, he's a more perfect king. Right. Okay. Well, what we're really saying, it's you can see the way these analogies are going, and really God is the king. So like when I was reading, I've just been reading through all the wisdom literature again, and the sort of insistence upon the fear of God, I think is an aspect of this, because you're afraid of Pharaoh, and like the fear of God is I think an aspect of this, is that sort of awe, that sort of obedience, that sort of humble deference is what's given to God. And there's an analogy there, I think, for what's happening in the tyrannies. Right? That's why we use the word fear. Mm-hmm. Right? It's like the fear of God isn't really fear.
Right.
But it's the kind of things that slaves have of their masters. Right. You're going to have this instead.
Right.
And so we call it fear.
Right. And what's really cool, and to kind of get to the point here, is that fear then also has the effect of making disdainful and distasteful fear for man.
Right.
So at the same time that you can say fear the Lord, right, you can start to say things like, well, only the Lord should be feared in this manner. Like, why do you fear him? Like they talk about the God kings Sennacherib, and they say, like, don't fear him. His arm is but an arm of flesh.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So you have the ability to, once God takes over those forms, right?
He undoes
what happened? Yeah, but the undoing is really cool, because so he takes all the forms. He takes sacrifice and kings and priests and temples, and he takes them and he says, okay, now I am their object, right? And then what happens is, because he has this claim on all of them, when we turn and look at their tyrannical, like where they came from, we don't trust them anymore. Mm-hmm. I mean, in one way, I think that's really important, because we're trying to get at why the church can, in some ways, not according to its like fallenness as an institution, but according to its structures, seem to imitate tyranny. And in some ways, what is happening is that it is doing that because it is taking up the human forms that we have and making it impossible that they be orientated towards man and his gain and ultimately his idolatry anymore, because now it's for God. So when you think about the incarnation, we'll just do the incarnation real quick. Easy
Okay.
peasy. Yeah.
Hinge of all the cosmic.
When you
history,
think about, okay, if the fundamental sin is that you want to be like God, and then the moment in which we're saved is when God actually becomes man.
Right.
The way that you could describe this as a negative action on God's part is that now, since God has entered history, any claim that any man makes to actually be God is rendered ridiculous, suspect, and impossible. I mean, why is it the case that we have massive accumulations of power, but we don't believe that there are any gods anymore?
Right.
Like
because God has rendered the word and the concept God no longer accessible to the
it's
tyrant.
not available to us.
It's not available to the tyrant, right?
It's not, because it's Christ.
He's appropriated it and diffused it, destroyed it.
Right. All you can be now is the Antichrist. You can't. You can no longer be a god. You can only be the Antichrist because Christ has revealed himself as the image of the Father, which means that if you are going to try to do the same, you can only do it as another Christ. You can only say, I am Jesus Christ in some way. Now, again, this is obviously, I'm not saying, what I'm saying is this is the effect of Christian civilization, right? As Christianity is realized in the world, you create people who can't be scared of gods anymore because there's one God and he has been revealed as a man, and any other man can only have access to the Father through that particular man.
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? It's a prevention.
Do you realize, that when the Romans went after Christians, like I've been studying this recently, and why did they go after the Christians and not the Jews? And it seems to turn on the incarnation because what they thought the Christians were asserting was that God had been man. And that if you just believed in the sort of Platonic God, the sort of God of all goodness, that's the source, okay. Yeah. Right? That's philosophically supportable.
Yeah.
But as soon as you argue that God has entered into the world, so God made man, now you're challenging the emperor. Right? So that was what it was turning on, not their lack of worship of the pantheon. Lots of people didn't worship the pantheon. They weren't concerned about that. It was Christ.
Yeah.
Right.
Love it.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we enter into the New Testament, it's not that God changes his methods, it's that it's a fulfillment of the law. Okay.
Yes.
So he is still taking up the world that we've given. Like we have to be willing to, it can feel blasphemous at times, but we have to be willing to say that the form that the church takes, like the body of Christ, is not this idea that's just instantiated ahistorically, but that it's still God humbling himself to enter into our humanity, not another humanity, our humanity.
Of course.
So the fact that like the churches we built were in the temples of the old gods it's absolutely right, because we're still taking the form and then orientating it towards God so that it can never be orientated towards man again. It's a preventative work of the gospel. I mean,
right.
It as much as it can be described positively, it can also be described as destroying sin and its structures. Okay, so the church, I think, and this is where I'm really sort of speaking for myself here, I do think it has in some way a preventative attack on tyranny precisely in its taking up of the trappings of power. So what I mean is like, so the question more specifically was things like is dogma negotiable? Isn't that propaganda in the sense of just like a message delivered from top down, you know? And the thing is,
first of all, the answer is sort of. I mean, what I mean is that dogma is articulated historically in history for historical reasons,
right?
As a part of the discussion that the church is having over what the truth is, and
the church is always claiming to be mediating and not creating.
That's right.
That truth. I mean, it's
but
this is the tradition.
But there's a great more truth that we have not articulated as dogma yet.
Yeah, of course.
Like an infinite amount.
But all I want to say.
So it's always, I guess what I'm saying is it always is in fact bound in the historical process.
Okay, but what all I want to say is this.
Okay.
Is that when you have a pope with 3 crowns on his head, sitting on a throne, giving a dogma, right?
Yeah.
On the face of it,
With people kissing his feet.
and his ring,
Yeah.
On the face of it, I want to absolutely agree that you have the trappings of tyranny. Okay, in precisely the same way that I want to agree that the Christmas tree is pagan.
Yeah.
Because I think the form is taken up because then, so then you have, that's the fullness of power on display. Okay, but then ask what is really going on, and you have a man who's saying that he is nothing but the mediation of the true King God, that he's not legislating in the sense of like giving laws,
No.
but is speaking,
teaching the truth,
the
preaching
tradition
the
that
gospel.
already exists. This is what,
and he refers to himself as the slave of the slaves of
Mhm.
God, the servant of the servants of God.
right.
Right.
And that's what I mean by an undoing.
Right. I
Because
see
now,
what you're
so in a world, precisely in a world in which the Pope can sit on his throne and explain dogma to people kissing his feet, is the same world in which someone like a Jeff Bezos
saying.
he can't, and he has all of the temporal power.
Right.
I mean, he has more power amassed within his money than I mean, it's God Kings would have dreamed.
Or think of the
This sort of
military power of the president of the United
Right.
States.
Right.
I mean, nothing. I mean, the Pope is laughable compared
But
to
what
that.
would happen if Jeff then got on his throne, put on his triple crown, and tried to
We would laugh at him.
we would laugh because he would be trying to be like the Pope.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We have set up a form which because it has undone it, means that it can no longer be imitated for man. It's been claimed for God. It can no longer have that same, in the exact same way, like that if someone claims to be God, we say things like, do you think he's Jesus Christ reincarnate or something? That's people say reincarnate because that's how we think.
So I think
That's my argument.
I think all this is true.
Oh, that's nice.
I do. I think that's a very good way of putting it. I do think, though, that we have to remember that when we say this, the just society, the perfect society, the church is not, in fact, adopting the tyrannical forms.
Yeah, right.
I mean, because when it
really
redirects them, it actually renders them a different thing.
Yes.
Okay, so it has some of the externals or the accidents of it, but
which is why those externals can change. It's like you don't have to wear the triple crown.
Right. So, for example, another example would be the way in which, because of sin, the reality of sin, to use power for the common good. So, exactly, to use it not self-interestedly, would sometimes require, very often does require, using that power against the perceived interests of those over whom you have the power.
Sure.
Okay. So what we can think of as like disciplining a child, passing laws that force or compel people to not do things that they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That these very well may be perfectly just uses of power, but because the corruption is in the one that the power is being wielded over,
mm-hmm.
the corrupt people are servile, right? Like, remember we talked from the very beginning that you have in the tyrant relationship, the master-slave relationship, it's actually a relationship, right? So like the slave has to be servile for that relationship to exist.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have corrupt people, there's servility there. And one of the ways then in which a good master has to use his power for the common good is to sort of enter into that servility in an attempt to undo it.
Mm-hmm.
So you might use fear, but you're using fear in order to move them past fear,
mm-hmm.
right? You need them to move into virtue,
mm-hmm.
but fear might be a place to begin,
mm-hmm.
right? Punishment, these sorts of things. So there can be, those things look like tyranny because what the tyrant's doing is taking those mechanisms and absolutizing them. Right. All of the social space is going to be governed by fear.
Right.
Well, it is. That doesn't mean that every instance of fear is tyrannical, right? I mean, you could say, well, every instance of fear sort of shares aspects with tyranny, looks like tyranny,
sure.
right? It's hard to distinguish between the two.
Right. I mean,
and if you're subject to it, you may not be able to distinguish between
mm-hmm.
the two. You might experience a just authority as tyrannical because you're corrupt,
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? So I think.
But the difference there's a difference, and it is just the exterior view of that looks the same, because for the person who is taking on a coercive or what looks like tyrannical form, it's precisely in response to that real corruption.
Right.
Whereas the point of tyranny is rule for private gain. So when that same action happens, they give a law in a coercive manner, for instance. The intention is that for that to always remain the case.
Yeah. In fact, what they want to do is create this. If the servility isn't there, they want to create it.
Right.
See, it has the opposite motive, because the motive of the just authority is to move people out of servility into freedom. The motive of the tyrant is to find anywhere where there's freedom and enslave it.
Right. Yeah.
Now, but the form of police, law, discipline is similar, right? I mean, it can be confusing what you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
But I would argue that it's not really ultimately the same thing.
No.
Even if it does somewhat look like it. So my point is that the church, if we think of it as the just society, so the church, including the laity and the whole sort of social order, does have to adopt tyrannical forms in order for it to achieve its end, which is the common good.
Mm-hmm.
So those are going to be there sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is that they are oriented towards their own surpassing, and they have within them the means to fulfill themselves by surpassing them, right? Like the beating of the swords into plowshares is really the objective.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really where we're going, rather than turning the plows into swords, which is what the tyrant does.
Right, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, and I think this is, in some ways, it explains both the similarity and the difference. So is the church using propaganda when it catechizes its people? It's like, well, to a corrupt people, catechesis is going to appear as propaganda. I mean, you think about
that's right. Yeah.
Think about people that are like birth control is an obvious example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we are whole scale corrupt. Most of the laity, and even maybe I don't know about most, but definitely a bunch of the clergy, all think birth control's fine. So then, how is something even as frankly reasoned out as Humanae Vitae received? Well, it's
propaganda,
top down law. This isn't the real world. You're giving us this past vision that's not the truth anymore. And, okay, so that's how it's received. But the point being that same teaching, as people grow into the virtue by which they can understand it, then begins to appear as catechesis.
Yeah, it's truth.
Teaching.
I mean, this is the difference. I think we talked about this in the section, the episode on propaganda, where we talked about preaching. That preaching the truth is a invitation to initiate people into the community that's building the truth, to the church.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a missionary. It's reaching out. So it's not people who are not a part of the conversation that's constructing the society of justice. It's an invitation to them, an instruction, and that can be you're not a part of it to the extent that you're corrupt, to the extent that you're a sinner, and I think I would be willing to say that in order to reach people who are corrupt, you may even have to adopt some of the tactics of propaganda, because that is what they're receptible. That's what they receive that. They're susceptible to it.
Right. So to use a birth control instance, you might use a tactic by which you don't reveal your true end, which is that they convert morally, and you just say something like, "Hey, this stuff's bad for you."
Yeah, it's like unnatural or something.
Yeah.
But I think a key would be that you're not lying.
No, you're not,
and that you don't have an ulterior motive.
Well, and maybe it's worth pointing out that what we're not saying is that you're just habituated into it appearing as normal or true. So what I mean is it actually has to be true if you're ever able to move out of a servile fear with which you accept it.
The truth can't be incidental. Right. So the truth has to the way, and what that means is that the mechanisms, the institutional mechanisms that are propagandizing in a good way, you could say, I guess, have to have within them the ability for fulfillment. So if it doesn't, if the truth, it's like, well, maybe what they're saying is true, but they're essentially just habituating people into the truth, irregardless of whether or not it's true, right? That's incidental to it. Well, then you just have Christianity as an ideology, Christianity as a fanatical system,
right? Whereas,
or Christianity, ultimately, what it is like hypocrisy,
right?
It's like the definition of hypocrisy. It's like the Pharisees who have the true law but are using it as a mechanism of social control,
Yeah.
rather than as a way of moving people into freedom.
Mm-hmm.
That's a corruption of the church,
and I think,
right? So
I mean, I don't think I'm alone in experiencing what distinguishes that kind of delivery of truth when it really is true is the ability to always move deeper into it. So what I mean is, like, if you think about the things that I was taught in my ignorance and sinfulness, I really was just given a top-down world of, like, Jesus Christ is God, God is Trinity, this, which if you just look at on the face of that, you could say, like, well, isn't that just propaganda? And it's like, yeah, but because it's actually true, it initiates a relationship of the person to the real world, which then their own creativity and freedom and rationality then begins to participate in, to the point that you're saying the same words, but then by the time you're growing older and you're thinking about it, when you are talking about the mystery of the Trinity, it's something that you can always know more about, can always freely have as your own, in the sense of
because the truth isn't owned by the person who is teaching you. They're just a mediator.
Right.
This is what we mean by true mediation.
Right.
It's just a mediator of the power of God, the truth of God.
Okay, so is the church a tyranny? Well, I think that we gave two answers. One, insofar as people are corrupt and sinful, it has to take on tyrannical forms, but that should not allow us to believe that there's not an essential difference in those forms. I mean, it's the difference between permanentizing the relationship of master-slave, and then the difference between that and acknowledging that it exists and using it so that slavery all chains can be broken.
Which is the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I think would be another way of saying that.
Yeah.
Like the law and grace, servility and freedom. And because the whole economy of salvation has law, has that component to it as a necessary piece of moving into fulfillment, doesn't mean that it's the same as Pharaoh.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Because there's also the New Testament.
and then that's the second, or it was the first thing we mentioned, but then I think, so you have that way in which the church can be tyrannical. Then you have the second way in which I think it literally is taking up contingent human forms of idolatrous power, claiming them for God so that they can never be used again without laughter.
Right.
I just love it.
Right.
It's why the church looks like it looks.
Yeah.
And it's why I really get annoyed when people are like, okay, let's get rid of all of these trappings because we want to be like a pure and simple church. It's like, well, yeah, but then the other guys can start being gods again, and we don't want that.
We don't want that. Yeah.
Okay, and then the third thing, though, I think that we can leave with this is that there's just the more purely negative way in which we can say that the church takes on tyrannical forms is when the church is sinning, when its clergy is
the church
sinning.
itself can be corrupt.
Yeah. So like is the church, like the church has basically in America become structurally a ginormous nonprofit that acts like it. With its employees, with its insurance models, with its investments in the market, with
lawyers.
With its lawyers, with its embarrassing
sort of risk management, HR procedures, the whole thing.
Yeah, and okay, so we can look at that and say, well, what's awesome about the church is how repulsive all that is, because if that was true of simply some other organization, we would say they were being normal.
They would be normal, yeah. But it upsets us because the church ought not to be normal.
Or the church ought not to be normal. And so those are tyrannical forms where you can feel it, right? So like if you are a employee of the church and you are getting your wage and your 401k from the church, and then that's threatened because your parish hired a consulting company and they determined that your job wasn't worth it or whatever, like you are undergoing tyranny within the church in a real way, and so and you're suffering it. But the point is that the church is sinning there. Yeah.
So the church is, it's like, again, St. Augustine, the city of man and the city of God intermingle and intermix, and in the hierarchical church and the institutional church, there's always the city of man in there, right, tugging at it, and some epochs worse than others, right, and that's why we need reform.
That's right. Okay, so I hope all of this answered the questions as they were given, and we really appreciate the feedback. We'll try to do these periodically, and probably a big one at the end. So
Sounds great. Thank you.
thanks so much. Bye.